vaccine and will be fired if they don't.
Wow.
That is the decree that has just come down. So we are looking at our options, but what a total outrage. And this comes, of course, in the heels of Gavin Newsom issuing mandates that no other state has when it comes to healthcare workers and when it comes to teachers. And so if this is really about public health, well, why doesn't any other state have it? Do the other 49 governors not care about public health? And so we got an indication, actually, of exactly what's going on today. The governor released his newest ads against the recall. You know, these ads you've been seeing on your TV and everywhere, based on over $50 million in special interest funding. Some of them feature the likes of Elizabeth Warren. Not really sure what she's doing here, telling us how to vote. She didn't really do that well when she actually ran here as a candidate. But anyway, keep her on. But the governor came out with his newest ads. And what do they say? Well, of course, those of us who are running to replace Newsom have said we will roll back those mandates. And so his ad came up and said, you have to vote against the recall, otherwise the new governor is going to roll back the mandates and COVID's going to spread. So it's just so clear. This is all just a political ploy. He wants to create a wedge issue. He wants to wrap himself in the vaccine as a political strategy. Never mind what the actual imperatives of public health are. Never mind what the demands of individual liberty are. He's just doing whatever it takes politically to perpetuate his own power. Which is exactly the way this has been handled from the very beginning. From the beginning. In May of 2020, I introduced a resolution to terminate the state of emergency. This was what? Not that long into all this. A couple months. I've since reintroduced that several times. Of course, it's never passed, because it would rely on the very people who just today imposed this mandate on my own staff members to actually go along with it. So in May of last year, I introduced that resolution, and when it became clear that the legislature was not going to act, we decided we had to go to the third branch of government, and James Gallagher and I filed a lawsuit. Because we had already seen that this so-called state of emergency was being used for purposes that were not entirely at all contemplated by our emergency services law. The California Emergency Services Act. I'm sure we're all familiar with this law by now. It's actually been on the books for 50 years. I believe it was Reagan who signed it. And for 50 years, governors have declared emergencies. For earthquakes, for fires, for medfly infestations. And they've used the law in an aggressive but targeted way to respond promptly to these emergencies. To put out the fire. To deal with the medfly infestation. To help recover from the earthquake. But Gavin Newsom was using this law in a way that none of the other governors for the last 50 years had ever even dreamt of using it. He, as a matter of fact, was citing a particular provision of the law that refers to the, quote, police powers of the state that no other governor had ever cited, and yet Newsom was citing in almost every order. And it's cited it dozens and dozens of times, claiming that he gets the full police power of the state by virtue of himself declaring there to be a state of emergency. So Kevin with Pacific Justice, which by the way is one of the true leading lights we have in this state and across the country, actually stole the James Madison quote I was going to cite on the Federalist Papers, because we actually cited this at the very beginning of our brief. And the key term, of course, is that concentrating all powers in the same hands is the very definition of tyranny. So it was quite jarring in our case to see that Gavin Newsom made the claim in writing several times in his brief that the California Emergency Services Act, quote, centralizes the state's powers in the hands of the government. It was almost verbatim what James Madison, the father of our Constitution, called the very definition of tyranny. And this was exactly the way he was using the law. He was issuing executive order after executive order. I put together a document it was probably in May of 2020, just that was a compendium of all the executive orders and all of the laws that he had changed or created single-handedly. And at that point, it was already hundreds of them. He was one pen stroke at a time, utterly changing the landscape of law in California. Across all of the legal codes we have, all of the policy areas we have, not just the public health code, but education, businesses and professions, elections, you name it. And why was he doing this? Was it to deal with COVID-19? Well, he actually told us on April 1st of 2020. I don't know if you've heard this, was not an April Fool's Day joke, unfortunately. On April 1st of 2020, Gavin Newsom said that he saw the coronavirus, its arrival on our shores, as, quote, an opportunity for a new progressive era. That's what he said. An opportunity for a new progressive era. An opportunity, he went on, to reshape the way we do business and how we govern. And that is the mentality that we have been living with for the last year and a half of our lives. And so James Gallagher and I were fighting in the courts to uphold the idea of a separation of powers. That we have the rule of law and the Constitution and checks and balances, even in an emergency, especially in an emergency. That's when it's most important. You know, our founding fathers, they were not unfamiliar with the concept of an emergency. After all, they just been through a revolution, a war against the most powerful country in the world. They knew what an emergency was, yet they still established checks and powers and still argued in the Federalist Papers and making the case for the Constitution for the importance of the separation of powers. So that's what James Gallagher and I argued. I've accidentally referred to him as James Madison before, which isn't a bad comparison. That was what we argued in the courts. We actually won a trial in Sutter County last year, although then the governor got a kind of stacked panel of justices on the appellate court, and they actually agreed with us on almost every legal issue, yet still found a way to overturn the decision. Each of the three justices had worked for a California governor before. And now the state Supreme Court, incredibly enough, has actually refused to hear the case, which is really, I think, disgraceful. I mean, in every other state where there's been a challenge to a governor's emergency powers, the state Supreme Court has been the one to take on the issue. And so, you know, I'll get to it in a second, I think, the path forward, but I think it's also important to know that in addition to the concerns about individual liberty and the rule of law in our system of government, you know, as sort of the defending those institutions as sort of our national DNA, as key to our character as a people, I mean, there's also the notion that the reason we have this system is because it tends to produce the best outcomes. When you actually have, you know, multiple people who are involved in the decision-making process. And I think that is reflected in the worst in the nation outcomes that we have gotten through the worst in the nation autocratic mode of government over the last year and a half. You know, Gavin Newsom, every step of the way, has opted for maximum government control, like no other state in the country. I mean, you name the issue, whether it's the lockdowns of businesses, whether it's the school closures, each of those 50 out of 50, worst in the country. You know, whether it is what's happened with our churches, whether it's masks, whether it's the vaccine, whether it's vaccine verification, quote unquote, vaccine passports. Every step of the way, Newsom has opted for maximum government control. And what have we gotten in return for that? Like, where is the evidence that it's made a whit of difference or that it's helped us in any way? The evidence is quite the contrary. In addition to, you know, having the worst economic outcomes in the country, second highest unemployment rate in the country throughout COVID, obviously the worst damage we've done to our kids, even lowering their life expectancy, according to the Journal for the American Medical Association. We've also had some of the worst public health outcomes. When you look to excess mortality, which takes into account COVID deaths as well as deaths from other causes, suicides, drug overdoses, delayed medical treatment, California has consistently been about the 5th or 6th worst of any state in the country, which is sort of, you know, what we've gotten used to as Californians. As we pay the highest taxes, we'll drive over the deepest potholes. You know, we sacrifice the most and get the least in return. And so what we've seen in the COVID era is sort of all of the things that were already so wrong with our state government have just been put on steroids, which is another good indication that this really has had nothing to do with public health. We already had the worst business environment in the country. We already had the worst restrictions on the right to earn a living, the right to work in the country, and then we had the worst business shutdown. We already had just about the worst public schools in the country, and then we had the worst school shutdown. And the cause, of course, is the same. We have a special interest group in this state whose business model is keeping kids trapped in failing schools. We already had the worst restrictions on religious liberty of any state in the country, and then we had the worst violations of the First Amendment during COVID, to the point that the U.S. Supreme Court had to slap Newsom down 5 times. And so if we have one thing, I guess, to thank this governor for, it's that he has provided such a compelling case study in everything that is wrong with California government, right? Which is why, as you might be aware, there's a little effort to get a new governor going on. And why? It's not just to reject Gavin Newsom and his extraordinary failures and abuses, but to reject and turn the page on all of the long-standing abuses and failures that have gotten us to this point. You know, we can begin a new era here in California. We can turn the page on this dark era of government control by lighting a new spark of liberty and self-government, by returning to the founding principles of our country. I mean, self-government, that was the basic innovation of our country. The idea that everyone, all of us, has a part to play in making our society work, in giving character to who we are as a people. We all have something to contribute. If you've ever read Alexis de Tocqueville, Democracy in America, he describes what he saw when he came to America. He's a Frenchman, and he observed what he saw in the early 19th century. And what astounded him most was just how politics was not something done at state capitals, but it permeated society. You know, that it truly was government by the people. And we have been moving farther and farther away from that as a country, and certainly in California more than anywhere else, farther and farther away from that as a state. And all Gavin Newsom has done in the last 16 months is fast forward that to his logical endpoint of one-man rule from Sacramento. And so just think, if we as Californians respond to the worst COVID experience in any state, that the maximum government control of any state, by throwing out our governor, I think that spark will rekindle the idea of liberty and self-government throughout the country. So I could say a lot more about the topic I've been asked to address, about emergency powers, and I have introduced legislation to reform the Emergency Services Act so that a state of emergency expires automatically after 30 to 60 days. But I will just say, which is common sense, other states do, by the way. I mean, the idea of an indefinite self-declared emergency with unlimited powers, not exactly compatible with our form of government. But I would tell you, if, in these next, I think it's like 28 days or something now, we truly have a golden opportunity to set our state on a whole new course, not only to save our state, but to save our country the same thing. So thank you everyone for being here. Thank you for being involved. And I happen to believe California is worth fighting for. So